Florida, October 2019. The night city lived its own life. Music was blasting in bars. Occasional cars drove through empty streets. People were heading home. No one knew that just a few blocks away from the busy streets, in a dark apartment, lay a dead body. A woman, alone. No chance to escape. The body was still warm, but life had left it. Deep strangulation marks on the neck. No chaos in the room, no signs of struggle. As if death came quietly, without a sound. And the killer? He was already far away, walking down the street, calm, unhurried, ordinary clothes and unremarkable face. No one would remember him. No one would give him a second glance. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't worried. Everything had gone exactly as he wanted. And while the city slept, he was hunting again. Wade Stephen Wilson never stood out. Just an average guy, one of thousands. 25 years old, thin, light hair, a few tattoos. If you saw him in a crowd, you wouldn't even notice him. But behind this ordinariness was emptiness. Wilson grew up in a troubled family. His father left when he was 10. His mother couldn't handle raising him. As a teenager, he was already on drugs, stealing, getting into trouble. He had been arrested for theft, assault, possession of illegal substances. He knew the system from the inside, but it didn't make him more careful. On the contrary, it only made him bolder. He was used to taking what he wanted. He loved the feeling of power. And when he killed for the first time, he realized it gave him more than anything else. Kristen Julian Melton was coming home after a late shift at the grocery store. She was tired, thinking only about getting to her apartment, taking a shower, and going to bed. A man was standing in the parking lot in front of her building. Tall, thin, dressed in cheap clothes. He looked like an ordinary passerby, maybe a neighbor. When Kristen reached the entrance, he spoke first. The conversation was easy, harmless. He said he was lost, looking for a friend's house, but his phone had died. Kristen wasn't the type to refuse to help. She took out her phone to help him find the address. At that moment, he took a step closer. The next morning, she was found dead. The apartment was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. He had entered with her. She hadn't suspected the danger. The cause of death, strangulation. Quick, silent. After the murder, he didn't leave right away. He turned on the shower, wiped his hands with a towel, turned off the light, calmly walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind him. Everything had gone perfectly, but just 2 days later, he felt it wasn't enough. Next target, Diane Ruiz, was walking down the sidewalk toward home. Late evening, empty street. Her steps were light, unhurried. He noticed her from afar, slowly drove up in his car, watching, waiting for the moment, then suddenly hit the gas. The impact was strong. Diane was thrown several feet. She was still breathing when he got out of the car and stepped closer. Her eyes were wide open, frozen with fear and confusion. But he didn't give her a chance to survive. Hands on her throat, slow, steady. Silence. He left the body on the roadside like a discarded object. This time he felt different. The first kill brought satisfaction. The second, adrenaline. He knew no one would catch him. No one remembered his face. No one could say who he was. But he didn't know he had already made a mistake. Security cameras had captured his car. Bloodstains remained on the hood, and the police were already looking for him. Fort Myers was living its usual life, but for the police, 2 murders in 3 days became a disturbing signal. Both crimes were committed cold-bloodedly, with no obvious signs of struggle. This didn't look like crimes of passion or robbery. This was something else. Detectives started with surveillance cameras. As they reviewed street footage, they noticed a man near Kristen's home on the day of her murder. Tall, thin, light hair. But the images were too blurry to identify him precisely. But with Diane, it was different. Cameras at an intersection captured the moment the car hit her. The recording quality was poor, but the make and model of the vehicle were clear enough. When police found her body on the roadside, they noticed damage to the hood. Forensics confirmed there were traces of blood. By the time this was verified, the owner of the vehicle had already been identified. Wade Stephen Wilson. Past arrests, records of theft, violence, drugs. Everything came together. The police knew who they were looking for. Now they just had to find him. But Wilson also felt the noose tightening around him. He abandoned the car, changed clothes, and left Fort Myers. He wasn't planning to hide. He just kept moving from city to city, sleeping at random acquaintances' places, stealing money, stealing cars. He thought he was untouchable, but the more he moved, the more traces he left behind. Cameras, witnesses, bank transactions. The hunt was already on. For several days, Wade Wilson was on the run. He changed cities, stole, slept wherever he could. But inside him, tension began to grow. It didn't feel like fear, more like irritation. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long, and then he did something no one expected. Late at night, sitting in a cheap motel, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Dad." The voice on the other end was surprised, but Wilson didn't give him time to ask questions. He started talking, at first hesitantly, then faster and faster, as if trying to unload a heavy burden. He confessed to everything. How he met Kristen, how he walked into her apartment with her, how he looked into her eyes as he squeezed her throat, how he followed Diane, how the car struck her body, how he heard her ragged breathing before he finished what he started. For the first time in his life, he admitted it all. His father was silent, a long silence, and then he did something Wilson definitely didn't expect. He called the police. When the police received the call from Wilson's father, they already knew who they were looking for. They just needed to pinpoint his location. It wasn't difficult. Credit card transactions, motel surveillance cameras. Within a couple of hours, the police knew exactly where he was hiding. When they knocked on the door, Wilson didn't try to run. He knew this was the end. He simply opened the door, raised his hands, and smiled. Wade Stephen Wilson's trial began 6 months after his arrest. He spent that entire period in county jail, awaiting proceedings. The charges were serious. First-degree double murder. The evidence against him was undeniable. Surveillance footage, blood traces, vehicle forensics. But most importantly, his own confession, recorded during interrogation. The victims' families were present in the courtroom. They watched him, hoping to see remorse. But Wilson remained just as he had been when police arrested him, calm, almost indifferent. The prosecutor sought the death penalty. His lawyers fought to save him, arguing for life imprisonment, citing his mental state and difficult childhood. But the jury didn't hesitate. After several hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty. The judge announced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Wade Stephen Wilson would never see freedom again. A few weeks later, he was transferred to Union Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Florida. This is a place where the most dangerous criminals are held. There is no hope, no future, only concrete walls, bars, and monotonous routine. On his first day, he was led down a long corridor where inmates shouted threats and taunts at him. He walked without reacting. They placed him in solitary confinement. That first evening, he sat on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. All he had now was silence and his own thoughts. After returning from solitary confinement, Wilson realized, loneliness in prison is weakness. Only those who had support survived here. So despite his independence, he made a decision to join one of the gangs. The choice was obvious: a group of white inmates who controlled part of the prison. They noticed him when he proved he wasn't afraid to fight. After several clashes with other inmates, he was offered protection. This meant safety, but also obligations. His life no longer belonged to him. Now he was part of a system that lived by its own rules. Inside the prison, violence was an everyday reality, but fighting was one thing, murder was another. Wilson was ordered to get rid of an inmate, a former member of their gang who had crossed the leader. Refusing was impossible. In prison, refusing could get you killed. At night in the shower when the guards weren't watching, he entered the room where the target was, a piece of sharpened metal in his hand. One quick strike to the neck. Blood splattered on the walls. The man collapsed, gasping for air. Within seconds, it was over. Wilson washed his hands and walked away as if nothing had happened. From that moment, there was no turning back. After the murder, his position in the gang was solidified. Now he was seen not just as a fighter, but as someone who could be relied on for the most brutal tasks. He was no longer just a criminal. He had become an executioner, willing to do anything for power and survival. But he knew People like him didn't live long. Wilson believed the prison belonged to him now. He was part of the gang. He had protection, status, power. But power in prison is an illusion. A few months after the murder, the guards launched a sudden raid. They turned the cells upside down. Weapons, drugs, and contraband phones were confiscated from the inmates. Several people gave them up. When the guards found the murder weapon hidden in the ventilation, it was over. A case review followed. Wilson was pulled from his cell and sent to a new trial. This time, the evidence was undeniable. The murder of an inmate, gang involvement, and attempted escape. It all added up to one fatal sentence. The judge didn't even pause before delivering the verdict. Death penalty by lethal injection. The sentence was final, and for the first time in a long time, he felt fear. After the sentencing, Wilson was transferred to death row. It was quieter here than in the regular prison. No one fought over territory, no one tried to escape. Everyone knew the only way out was to the grave. The inmates waited their turn. Weeks, months, years. Some filed appeals, some wrote letters to their families. Wilson didn't either. He knew there was no way out. A few days before the execution, he was offered a last meal and a chance to say his final words. He refused both. On the night before his execution, he didn't sleep. He listened to the prison living its usual life, guards talking, someone laughing in the distance, but none of it mattered anymore. In the morning, they came for him. Guards stood on both sides, locked him in handcuffs. The last hallway, the last steps. They laid him on the gurney, strapped down his arms and legs. A cold needle entered his vein. The last breath. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.